Eugene Mulero with Transport Topics, and joining us today is Joung Lee, Policy Director at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Joung, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Eugene.
Of course. AASHTO came out with its policy agenda for 2017, and you guys covered a variety of issues that you would like Congress and the Trump administration to address. Can you run us by some of the highlights and things that we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. I think we have a really unique opportunity right now, given that infrastructure is really one of the top 3 items in the national agenda, and that doesn't really happen all the time. The message that we're getting from both the new president and the 115th Congress is that amongst tax reform, looking at healthcare, that infrastructure really is something that seems to have a lot of bipartisan support going. And obviously from the state departments of transportation that AASHTO represents, what we would like to really see achieved is finally figuring out the revenue challenge that we've had for the federal surface transportation program, especially as it pertains to the Highway Trust Fund. As you know, the Highway Trust Fund has been running a cash deficit of about $15 billion every single year since about 2008, which has required transferring $140 billion of general funds into ostensibly a user fee financed trust fund that supports highway safety and transit investments all over the country. I think we've got ourselves a bit of a reprieve with the passage of the 5-year FAST Act.
Which expires in 2020.
That's exactly right. So I think in that medium to long-term time frame, we really have to figure out how do we ensure that this very crucial funding mechanism, again, for all parts of the country, is sustained for the long term. And I think even in the near term, if you're looking at some sort of a major infrastructure initiative, we would certainly hope that this is going to be something that, again, helps all parts of the country through, I guess the nomenclature these days is direct funding that provides funding support from the federal government to state and localities rather than looking heavily into private financing or other types of leverage mechanisms, which can help, certainly, but is certainly no substitute for revenue.
I want to get to funding more, get your reaction on what the chatter is on Capitol Hill in a second, but another policy issue is streamlining regulations. We saw the White House move toward that direction. What will AASHTO like to see?
This is certainly not a new area for us at AASHTO in looking at streamlining program and project delivery while ensuring environmental stewardship. We've actually had an entity called the Center for Environmental Excellence in partnership with the U.S. Department of Transportation since 2001. And what it does is to really bring all the different partners in the project and program delivery space to find ways to share best practices, identify innovative solutions, to enhance the way we, again, protect the natural environment while also meeting the economic and transportation needs that really only new projects and significant reconstruction of existing facilities can provide for. I think what opportunity we see as part of our legislative agenda this year is similar to the infrastructure funding push, that there seems to be strong desire both from the executive branch and the legislative branch to say, let's take a fresh look at how the regulations and the laws have been built up over the years. I think it's one of those things where over time things build up organically, where it wasn't by design that we have regulations, in which case some of them really overlap and become redundant. So if there's an opportunity to, again, take a step back and say, we all agree to certain outcomes here, and again, that is to make sure that especially bigger projects, but smaller projects as well, can be delivered on time in getting the proper permitting and environmental review approvals and the like. while also, again, ensuring that any kind of impact on the natural environment would be minimal. We all agreed to that outcome. Now let's see what would be the best way to do that, rather than saying, well, when you look at this regulation, that regulation, this regulation, we have to check off all of these boxes. So less focus on the process and more focus on the outcome.
And we've seen not only transportation officials from the freight sector and representing industry going before Capitol Hill this year, talking about regulations and urging lawmakers to address, what they deem as red tape. But we got an indication from some key transportation leaders that they're going to visit this issue and address this issue as authorizing policy moves forward. And then back to funding, also on Capitol Hill, we've had two high-profile congressional hearings, one in the House, one in the Senate. I know the Senate also had another congressional hearing where they talked about funding. Again, it was a subcommittee of the Commerce Committee.
Sure.
What we're hearing is some criticism about public-private partnerships, and this is from the rural perspective, lawmakers representing small town, et cetera. Can you weigh in AASHTO's reaction or take on what we've been hearing from Congress so far?
Sure. I think it's important to note that we have a very effective federal funding program structure right now. It's something that we've actually had over 100 years of the federal aid highway program that obviously was significantly ramped up through the 1956 Interstate Highways Act. And what it does is that it outlines the federal priorities, the national interest, what the federal program should really aspire to, and what it should bring, again, throughout the whole country in terms of benefits. What the funding stream looks like there is that what we've seen in the FAST Act, which is not different than what's been traditionally in the past, is about 92% of those federal dollars being provided by formula to states. Because what that then does is it provides that federal funding support for the kind of the bottom-up planning process that entails, at every state and local level. Every metropolitan area and, non-urban parts of the country have a 4-year capital program known as a Transportation Improvement Program.
Yeah.
States and metropolitan areas are also required to look at that 20-year view and assess the different needs, come up with different investment scenarios, and then match the projects into, put it in the capital plan, again, best ways to meet their regional goals. So there's a lot of public involvement that gets into that process and the public input, local elected official leadership. It's a very robust base to work with in terms of selecting the projects that are right under the federal funding support throughout the country, rather than having, say, a top-down driven, the federal government decides all in terms of how the dollars should be spent. So I think it really speaks well to the federal system of government that we have, in that there's a lot of flexibility for the state and localities when it comes to federal transportation funding, but obviously that federal role is still substantial. I talk so much about that funding aspect because when you're asking about public-private partnerships, there have certainly been a great advance in the recent decade or so in terms of being able to attract more private capital, being able to utilize new financing mechanisms that can really leverage, what revenue streams that may come your way as a project sponsor by the means of, user fees, like tolls and fuel taxes, or something broader based, revenues that may come in again to the project sponsor. The challenge that we've seen in the recent years when it comes to financing projects or something again like public-private partnerships that induce a lot of private investment both on the debt side and on the equity side is that there are only a certain number of projects in kind of the overall spectrum of total projects that are needed around the country that can generate the kinds of return on investment that private partners look for, or even for non-P3 projects that is financed through debt, just the means to pay back that debt over time. So I think that really limits the possibility to typically toll-financed highways, or what we've seen more in the P3 sphere, what's known as this availability payment approach, where the public sector still makes regular payments for building the facility and operating and maintaining it by the private sector, but that payment still has to come from some source within the public treasury.
You're going to have AASHTO is hosting its Washington briefing starting from February 28th through March 3rd here in Washington, and you're going to have state DOTs from all over the country. Can you give us a preview as to the conversations and the theme of the briefing? Is P3 something that the rural DOT directors are going to bring up? Help us, paint a picture for us.
Sure. I think, certainly, again, given the national dialogue surrounding infrastructure and transportation right now, it's really a timely opportunity to be able to bring the state DOT leaders from throughout the country to come to Washington, D.C. for our Washington Briefing Conference this year. They do a lot of Hill visits while they're in town, naturally, but in terms of the program and the agenda that we do have set up, we're going to be featuring a number of senior congressional leaders in the transportation sphere. So, leaders like Chairman Bill Schuster,
over in the House Transportation Committee.
Exactly, at the House T&I, Ranking Member Peter DeFazio from that committee as well. And then we will also have Senators John Barrasso and Tom Carper, who lead the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And then we'll also hear from Senator Deb Fischer, who is going to be one of the luncheon speakers, and she is the chair of the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Surface Transportation.
And out of Deb Fischer's office, we saw one of the early legislations in the 115th Congress to address puts together a long-term solution for the Highway Trust Fund.
Sure.
Joung, I want to thank you for joining us today, and check out AASHTO's website for all information about the Washington briefing and their daily updates, and check out Capitol Agenda on Tuesdays when Congress is in session at ttnews.com. Thanks.
Thank you.